What's up guys, welcome to another Tutorial Tuesday. Today's episode we're going to be talking all about RAW versus JPEG.
I'm going to use the drift method. Freaking incredible. Round F16 for that to get that sunburst.
Alright, so what's the difference between RAW and JPEG? What are RAW and JPEG? Well, those are the ways that your camera is going to record the data from the sensor. So RAW is exactly like it sounds. It's straight out of the camera. There's no manipulation, no compression, no nothing. Every bit of light and data that comes in and hits that sensor is saved onto that image. And a JPEG, when it's done in camera, means that your camera is going to throw out some of that data because there's too much, and they want to compress it so it's a better file size, because RAW file sizes are huge. So what do we mean by compress? Well, when it turns it into a JPEG in camera, there's a lot of data in the RAW image, and so it's going to determine, in order to make the file size smaller, it's going to throw some of that data out. And a lot of that data is going to be data that we don't necessarily see, especially that's in the dark shadows or the bright highlights. And that'll make it smaller, but that'll also make it less able to be manipulated when you get it into Photoshop. Like if it's too dark or if it's too bright and you want to try to save those highlights or save the shadows or bring detail back into the image, in JPEGs, you're going to have a harder time doing that. And the same thing goes for color too. So it's going to take out some of the data that's in the color in order to make that smaller file size. And then when you go into Photoshop or whatever you're using to boost the saturation and make it pop again, then some of that color data is not going to be there, and it's going to artifact and break down. All right, so let's do a little photo shoot real quick. So it's finally fall, even though it's still like 80-something degrees here in New Mexico. I want fallness. So I got some pumpkins here, and we're going to do a little photo shoot. So I have my camera set in RAW plus JPEG so that I can have both at the same time so that we can compare them when we jump back into the computer. But what we're going to look at, so I'm going to show you the differences, because this is a really dynamic scene. And what I mean by that is the highlights right here and on the side of my face, and the shadows right here on the pumpkins, to get this perfectly shot is going to be very difficult. So this is where, if you want to change that stuff and you want to like rescue these highlights so that they're not completely blown out, or bring out the details in these shadows, then this is where having that RAW file is really going to help. If we're going to boost the saturation in the colors to make these fall colors pop, that kind of stuff. So we're going to shoot RAW plus JPEG for this, and then we're going to go back into the computer and I'll show you the differences. So real quick, before we go any further, this is not something that I really like debating or anything like that in terms of RAW versus JPEG and which is better and all that stuff. There are times for both, and it's up to you to decide how important or how necessary one versus the other is. If you want to shoot in JPEG, that's absolutely fine, especially if you're not editing or you don't have access to editing. A lot of people don't, and that's okay. If you want to keep those file sizes small, these cameras, I'm shooting with a 5D Mark IV, 30 megapixels. There are cameras out there with much bigger megapixels. That in a RAW image makes for a very large file size, so it's not always necessary. Okay, so if you're interested in RAW files and how to get your camera set up for that, I'm gonna go over it real quick for mine, which is in the Canon system, but it's gonna be, just check your manual for how to do it. It's gonna be pretty similar for anything. So I'm gonna go in here to menu, or my quick menu, and I'm gonna select the output, and it's gonna have RAW, and then it's going to have JPEG and these little dashes, and by default it's going to be on this JPEG, and you're not going to see the RAW selected. So we're going to hit that, and then that's going to have the RAW plus JPEG. So if you want to do both, you can do that, or you can have it like me. If you switch it to the minus sign under JPEG, then it will be just a RAW, and then you'll see on the back of your screen here in my Q menu, I see just RAW. So I keep mine set to RAW all the time, and I do that because of all the reasons I mentioned before. I pretty much would never post an image that I don't edit, and that's just because I enjoy it, and I'm also a professional, so I'm always editing my photos. So I think it's important to me personally to keep the RAW files, and then the other reason is because when you export them after you're done tweaking them and photoshopping them and whatever, then you're going to export them to a JPEG anyways, because JPEG is the most common photo type to have for the internet and Instagram and Facebooks and all of that stuff. So that's what I do, and that's how mine's set up.
Alright, so I've got a couple of images here. I did a couple of different shots where I overexposed, underexposed, and properly exposed. So this one is the underexposed, and it was underexposed by about 2 stops. Here you can see is the CR2, which is the RAW file, and here is the JPEG file. So already if we just look at them, we can see there's not as much detail in this JPEG already, and that's, like I said, that's the camera throwing out the data that's in there in order to make that smaller image. So let's go ahead and open this up. So let's do just an overall exposure increase so that we can bring these shadows up, and let's just bring it up by like 2.5 stops. Realistically, hopefully you wouldn't never go over that, although you certainly can, but I want to start seeing what's going on here in this JPEG. So we'll do the same. We'll bring the exposure up by 2.5 stops. Alright, so here's the JPEG, and then here's the RAW on the left, and you can see the difference. This is when we brought the exposure up by 2.5 stops. The RAW has a lot more detail. You can see the contrast here, you can see the colors, you can see the details that are there that are just not there on the JPEG. So you can see where it's breaking apart right here, and that's where it's turning funny colors, and you can see that's not happening in here. And that's the artifacting it's breaking down. Alright, so let's look at the highlights now. Okay, so here's one that's overexposed. So I'm going to do the same thing except the opposite. So I'm going to do -2.5. Okay, now with the JPEG and camera RAW, I'm going to do -2.5 again. So it's definitely obvious on this. I mean, look how muddy this is and how lack of contrast and flat it is. And now let's zoom in. Okay, we're zoomed in to 100%. Let's look at these leaves. Alright, here you go. So 100% JPEG on the right, RAW on the left. I mean, look how much more detail and more color is in this RAW file that we've reduced by 2.5 stops of light. This is completely blown out still, and what that means is it just took all of the data out. It took all of this data right here that was in here when it compressed it in the JPEG, and it took all of that out. So no matter what we do, we can't recover it. And that's the big difference. I mean, just look at that difference. That is a huge difference between the detail, the sharpness, the contrast, the lights, the darks, the highlights, the shadows, all of that. So this is why I shoot in RAW all the time. Because I want those details, I want that color, and I want to be able to push this image if I want to, without it breaking down as badly as this over here.
All right, so hopefully that helps you understand the differences between RAW versus JPEG and why you would want to use one versus the other. And hopefully that helps you get an idea of your personal setup and what might be best for you. So a lot of the things that I do, if you want to follow along with my Photoshop tutorials and the different types of photography tutorials I do, then it could definitely behoove you in the future to start thinking about switching to RAW. And of course, just keep in mind that a lot of stuff comes with that. You're going to need an editor, you're going to need Lightroom or Photoshop or something. Your cameras usually come with a proprietary software that can read their own files. So at minimum, you can get Canon's DPP or Nikon's version or whatever, and you'll always have something to edit those RAWs, but you need to think about that. With the JPEGs, anything can read that and you're good to go. You can still edit them, however, you won't be able to get as much detail out of them should you need that. So if you like this stuff and you want to see more, definitely make sure you subscribe to the channel. I've got new videos every Tuesday and Friday. Hit that like button if this helped you out, because it really helps me out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. If I can get this cat off of me. All right, Alexis, I can't shoot when you're here on my lap because I need to be in you. Okay, so. Yeah, sniff the pumpkin. Okay. All right, let's do this.